2 nights before New Year's. The living room looked like it had been hit by a storm of suitcases, all different colors and sizes. Early the next morning, our family, all 6 of us, was flying to California for a long vacation. This was the first time in the 3 years since I had married into the Davidson family that we would all be traveling somewhere far together. Our living room was a mess. Carol, my mother-in-law, was busy ordering my father-in-law, Arthur, to stand 2 enormous suitcases neatly against the wall. Emily, my husband's sister, was trying to cram a 4th outfit into her suitcase, which was already covered in glittery stickers. I was sitting quietly in a corner. I checked my own luggage. My clothes, toiletries, medicine, and a few boxes of expensive artisanal wellness supplements as a gift for a friend in California were neatly arranged inside. My husband, Mark, walked over and handed me a box of motion sickness pills. "Keep this in your carry-on, honey. Take one before we board the plane tomorrow." I smiled at him as I took the medicine, but out of the corner of my eye, I caught Carol's movement. She glanced down the hallway toward her room for a moment, and it looked like she was holding something dark. I pretended I hadn't noticed anything. I zipped up my bag and tightened the straps. And, just as I expected, a few minutes later, Carol came out holding a plate of sliced apples. "Lena, honey, have some fruit," she said, her voice 3 times sweeter than usual. "You must be tired from packing." "Thank you, Carol," I replied. I took a piece of apple and naturally turned my gaze back to my suitcase. The position of the zipper pull had changed slightly from before. It was nudged a little further inward. Carol sat on the sofa and began telling Emily not to pack so many unnecessary things, all while slowly spearing an apple slice with a toothpick. She never once looked in my direction. After nearly half an hour of frantic final preparations, all of us were finally done packing. 5 large suitcases were lined up by the door like soldiers waiting for orders. Carol pointed to a silver suitcase with a gray stripe on the side and said to Emily, "Emily, that one's mine, okay? Remember that for tomorrow. Don't get them mixed up." That was my suitcase. Emily just nodded in response, not even looking up from her phone. That night, lying in bed, Mark fell asleep quickly. I stayed awake, staring at the ceiling. Only the faint glow of the streetlights filtered through the gap in the blinds. What had Carol secretly put in my suitcase? Valuables, money, or something the world wasn't supposed to know about? She could have only 2 possible goals: to frame me for a crime or to use me to smuggle something. And if there was a problem, I would be the one to take the fall. Either way, her motive was despicable. At 4 a.m., the whole house woke up to a flurry of noise. Emily was complaining because she couldn't find her contact lens solution. Arthur kept rechecking if the gas on the stove was turned off. Carol counted the passports and plane tickets inside her small handbag several times. When I came out of the room after getting dressed, Carol met me, holding my coat. "Lena, honey, it's cold outside. Put this on." I took the coat, and as I put it on, I gently felt the pockets empty. But near the armpit, I felt a tiny, hard lump sewn into the lining. You wouldn't notice it unless you were specifically looking for it. I continued putting it on as if I felt nothing and zipped it up. The airport shuttle we had booked was already downstairs. The driver helped load the 5 large suitcases into the back. Carol never strayed from my suitcase's side, constantly pressing down on it as if she was afraid it might run away. Emily was the last one to get in the van, muttering, "I'm still so sleepy." The vehicle traveled along the highway toward the airport. Outside, the sky was still pitch black. Carol was sitting diagonally in front of me, and using the reflection in the van's window, she was secretly watching me. I leaned on Mark's shoulder and pretended to be asleep. But in my mind, I was clearly replaying what I had done at 3 a.m. when everyone was in their deepest sleep. I had tiptoed into the living room and, using a hairpin, in just 30 seconds, I swapped the luggage tags and the unique ribbons tied to my and Emily's suitcases. My suitcase now had Emily's glittery luggage tag and was tied with her favorite pink scarf. Meanwhile, her suitcase was now covered by my old, drab gray waterproof cover and was sitting quietly where my bag had been. "Carol," I thought, "the surprise you worked so hard to prepare is about to be returned to its rightful owner." The lights in the domestic departure terminal were bright, and it was more crowded than we expected. Carol was rushing as if the plane would leave us behind if we were a second late. The line at the check-in counter was long. Arthur held our IDs while Carol kept her eyes glued to the 5 suitcases as they were tagged one by one and placed on the conveyor belt. "Mom, my suitcase!" Emily suddenly shouted, pointing at the conveyor belt. The suitcase I had covered with the drab, gray, waterproof cover was slowly sliding away. The color drained from Carol's face. She spun around and looked at the silver suitcase left beside us, the one with Emily's glittery luggage tag. Isn't this Emily's?" Her voice rose. I looked at the suitcase with a puzzled expression. "Oh, that one's mine, Carol. Didn't Emily's just get checked in?" I pointed at the conveyor belt. "See, it has the tag." Mark came over, looked at the tag, and said, "She's right, Mom. This is Lena's. Emily's is already on its way." He patted the silver suitcase. "We'll take this one with us. Lena will need her jacket, she might get cold." Carol's jaw dropped. She stared at the silver suitcase, unconsciously twisting the end of the scarf hanging around her neck. Her usual calm and composed demeanor began to crack. Underneath, I could see worry and fear. She looked like she wanted to say something, but the words caught in her throat and she swallowed them back down. How did this happen?" she kept whispering. "Oh, Mom, you're probably just stressed out and got confused," Emily said, linking her arm through her mother's and pulling her along. "Come on. We still have to go through security. We might be late." As her daughter pulled her, Carol looked back every 3 steps. Her soulless eyes were stuck to the silver suitcase until Arthur called out from ahead, "Carol, hurry up!" Only then was she forced to turn forward, but her steps were unsteady. The line for the security check was also long. We placed our carry-ons in the plastic bins and took off our coats. Carol's movements noticeably slowed when it was her turn. She held on tightly to her coat, hesitating. A young TSA agent said politely but firmly, "Ma'am, please place your coat in the bin as well." Only then did Carol seem to snap out of it and quickly tossed her coat into the bin. The moment she walked through the metal detector, a sharp alarm blared. A female agent politely asked her to step aside while she checked her with a handheld scanner. When the scanner passed over her waist, it beeped again. Carol's face turned as white as paper. "Ma'am, do you have anything in your pockets?" the agent asked. Carol hurriedly fumbled through her coat pockets and, after a moment, pulled out a couple of quarters. "Oh, I forgot about these." The agent nodded, scanned her again, and let her pass. In that short time, our family had already made it to the other side of security, collecting our things and waiting for her. Emily looked annoyed, scrolling through her phone. Mark whispered to me, "Mom seems really on edge. Her hands are shaking." I watched Carol walk toward us. Her steps seemed heavy. There were beads of sweat on her forehead. The first thing she looked at was the silver carry-on I was holding. Her eyes narrowed and then quickly darted away as she pretended to adjust her handbag. Oh, I'm really getting old, panicking over a simple trip. She forced a smile, but her voice was hoarse. Arthur patted her on the back. It's okay. We're here now. Let's go wait at the boarding gate." As we walked to the gate, Carol fell into step beside me several times, looking like she wanted to say something but hesitating. Finally, she lowered her voice and leaned in. I could smell the strong scent of the cold cream she used. "Lena," her voice was strained and full of anxiety, that carry-on of yours. Have you been holding it the whole time? No one else touched it?" I turned and gave her a perfectly gentle smile. "Don't worry, Carol. I've had it with me the entire time. Why? Is there a problem?" Nothing, she answered quickly. But her eyes, like hooks, scanned the suitcase one more time. "Take care of it, okay? Take good care of it. Everything in there is important." "I will." "I know," I nodded and answered calmly. "It's just clothes and personal things, right? Even if it gets lost, it's okay. We can just buy new things there." The corner of Carol's mouth twitched, and she couldn't speak. Her steps grew even heavier. She would occasionally glance at the flight information on the screen, and then in the direction of the TSA inspection area in the distance. Her fingers fidgeted restlessly. I knew exactly what she was afraid of. It wasn't losing the luggage she feared, but its contents being revealed to the world. Many passengers were already seated at the boarding gate. Mark bought coffee while Emily listened to music on her headphones, watching videos. Arthur was reading a magazine. Carol couldn't sit still. She would stand up, check the boarding time on the screen, sit back down, and tighten her grip on the handbag in her lap. I placed the silver suitcase by my feet, leaned against it slightly, and started checking work emails. My posture was completely relaxed. Out of the corner of my eye, I could feel Carol's stare, like a burning needle repeatedly pricking the suitcase. An announcement echoed through the terminal, stating that boarding for our flight was beginning. Since we were in business class, we had priority. Carol nearly jumped out of her seat. "Let's go. Hurry up. We need to get on board right away so I can relax," she said. Her panic was far beyond normal. Carrying our carry-ons, we entered the jet bridge after our tickets were scanned. We walked down the corridor toward the plane. At the very moment we were stepping through the aircraft door, we heard a faint commotion from the direction of the TSA inspection area. It wasn't loud, but it was audible if you were listening for it. I didn't stop and continued inside. A flight attendant smiled and pointed us to our seats. Carol sat by the window, practically pressing her face against the glass, staring back in the direction where the jet bridge connected to the terminal. Under the dim cabin lights, her face was ashen. She gripped the armrest so tightly her knuckles turned white. The airplane door closed with a heavy thud. The flight attendants began their safety demonstration. Carol suddenly turned to look back, across the aisle. At that moment, I was carefully placing the silver suitcase in the overhead compartment. Then I calmly sat down and fastened my seatbelt. She saw the suitcase neatly stowed, and then she looked at me. The muscles in her face twitched several times. A mixture of intense confusion, anxiety, and a fear she could no longer control brewed in her eyes. The plane's engines hummed to life, and it began to move along the runway. The object she had worked so hard to smuggle was now safely stored in the overhead compartment above her own daughter. Meanwhile, her daughter had checked luggage once mine that contained a shocking surprise. The plane picked up speed and took off. I felt my body lighten. Suddenly, Carol covered her mouth and gagged. A cold sweat dripped from her temples. This wasn't motion sickness. The plane climbed steadily above the clouds. Outside the window, the sun broke through. The flight attendants began serving drinks. Carol asked for warm water, but her hands were shaking so badly that the cup and saucer clinked together, creating a faint, rattling sound. Mark leaned over, concerned. "Mom, are you okay? You look so pale." "I'm fine." Carol abruptly set the cup down, splashing a few drops of water. "My chest just feels a bit tight. I'm probably just tired." Her gaze kept uncontrollably darting to the overhead compartment above me before quickly looking away as if she'd been burned. The silver suitcase remained silent in the darkness. I accepted a glass of orange juice from the flight attendant and smiled at Mark. "Mom is probably just nervous. It's her first time on a long flight. She'll be fine once she gets some rest." After I spoke, I reclined my seat, put on my eye mask, and pretended to sleep. In the darkness, my other senses sharpened. I could hear Carol's heavy, irregular breathing beside me. I could hear the repetitive scratching of her fingernail against the seatbelt buckle, and I could hear how she tried to start a conversation with Arthur several times, only to give up and sigh. Hours passed with the drone of the engines. The cabin lights dimmed, and most passengers were asleep. I removed my eye mask and stood up to go to the restroom. As I passed Carol's seat, her eyes were closed, but I could see them darting rapidly beneath her eyelids. When I returned from the restroom, I didn't sit down right away. I stood for a moment in the galley, watching the sea of cotton-like clouds outside the window. A moment later, I heard footsteps approaching. It was Carol. She had come to the galley, too. Her face was still pale, and dark circles were forming under her eyes. "Lena," her voice was hoarse. In the narrow galley, she glanced around. There were no flight attendants nearby. Only the occasional snore could be heard. "I wanted to ask you something, honey." She moved closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper. That suitcase. Are you sure you didn't let it out of your sight before we boarded? No one else touched it? Or maybe you opened it?" I put on an expression of perfect surprise. "Carol, why do you keep asking about that suitcase? I've had it with me the whole time. I haven't opened it. I finished packing last night. I paused for a moment and looked into her trembling eyes. Is there something special in that bag? If you put something important in my bag, you can just tell me. We're family, after all. No, nothing special. Her reaction was sharp. Her voice rose suddenly, then quickly fell again. Her chest heaved. I was just worried that, since you're young, you might misplace things. That's all. She waved her hand dismissively, opened a bottle of water, and took several large gulps. Water dribbled down the side of her mouth, but she didn't seem to notice. She didn't ask any more questions. She didn't go back to her seat either. She leaned against the cold wall of the galley like a statue. With vacant eyes, she watched the endless blue sky outside, muttering something inaudible. I could clearly see the muscles in her jaw twitching. She was terrified. Absolutely terrified. She no longer had time to wonder why I had the suitcase. All her fear was focused on one thing. That suitcase was about to be opened by authorities in California. I returned to my seat. Mark was watching a movie on his tablet. He offered me an earphone. I shook my head, pointed upward, and motioned that it might be too loud. He smiled in understanding. For the rest of the flight, Carol didn't sleep. When the flight attendant served a meal, she barely touched it. Every time the plane experienced a bit of turbulence, she would grip the armrest like a startled rabbit and glance at the overhead compartment as if there was a time bomb hidden there. When Arthur woke up and saw her state, he complained softly, "We're here to enjoy ourselves, not to mope around. You'll bring the kids' mood down." Carol turned and glared at him. The look, filled with resentment and terror, silenced Arthur. She turned back to the window, her body rigid. The long journey was nearing its end. The captain's announcement came on. In 40 minutes, we would be landing. The flight attendants asked everyone to straighten their seats and fold up their tray tables. The cabin buzzed with the sounds of people getting their things in order. The passengers were cheerful, full of anticipation for their vacation. But Carol, as if hearing a death sentence, began to tremble uncontrollably. She kept unbuckling and rebuckling her seatbelt, then suddenly stood up and tried to open the overhead compartment. "Ma'am, please remain seated and fasten your seatbelt. The plane is now descending." A flight attendant quickly approached and stopped her. Her voice was polite but firm. "I just need to get my coat. I'm freezing." Carol's voice trembled. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but you cannot open the overhead compartments at this time. It's for your safety." The flight attendant stood in her way. Carol stood there, staring at the silver suitcase just within reach, yet so far away. Her face was a mask of desperation. She slowly returned to her seat, her fingernails digging deep into the leather of the armrest. The plane began its descent, and we felt the change in pressure. Emily complained that her ears hurt and chewed some gum, but Carol seemed to feel nothing. She just bit her lower lip so hard she could taste blood. Outside the window, the landscape became clear. Green fields, charming towns, winding rivers. The plane touched down on the runway with a slight jolt and a roar. We had finally arrived. "Yes!" Emily exclaimed. The plane slowly taxied toward the terminal. Passengers switched on their phones in unison. Carol took hers out too. The light from the screen illuminated her bloodless face. Her fingers trembled over the screen. She tried to make a call several times but kept stopping. Finally, she helplessly lowered the phone and covered her face. Her shoulders began to shake uncontrollably. It wasn't loud sobbing, but a silent despair that seemed to come from the very marrow of her bones. The door opened, and fresh air streamed in. People rushed to stand up and grab their belongings. I stood up, carefully opened the overhead compartment, and took down the silver suitcase. Carol's gaze, as if pulled by a magnet, was fixed on the suitcase's zipper lock. Holding the suitcase, I said to her, "Carol, we're here. Let's go." She didn't move. Arthur nudged her. "Carol, what are you doing? Let's go." Only then did she seem to wake from a dream and quickly stood up, but she lost her balance and nearly fell. Arthur caught her. She pushed her husband's hand away and shakily followed us out of the plane and into the corridor. Her steps were unsteady, and she nearly tripped several times, but her eyes never wavered, fixed on the suitcase in my hands as if it were both her only life raft and her executioner. As we headed toward baggage claim, she gradually slowed down until she was lagging behind everyone. From up ahead, Emily called out, "Mom, hurry up, we still have to get our checked bags." There were crowds of people around the baggage carousel. With a single glance, I spotted the suitcase with the drab, gray, waterproof cover sitting alone in the inspection area off to the side. Next to it stood two uniformed TSA officers with serious expressions. They were looking at an electronic device in their hands, then looking at the suitcase, as if confirming something. Carol followed my gaze. It was as if all the bones in her body had suddenly dissolved, and she froze on the spot. The last trace of color drained from her face. Her mouth fell open, and a hoarse sound escaped her throat, but no words came out. Her eyes were desperately fixed on the gray suitcase. And then, in a very slow, mechanical motion, she turned and looked at the silver suitcase in my hand, the suitcase that had passed through without any issues. In that instant, she understood everything. The gray suitcase sat like a tombstone in the inspection area. The two officers stood stiffly, their hands resting near the equipment on their belts. As they watched the crowd retrieving their luggage, they were looking for the owner. Carol's feet seemed nailed to the polished floor. A rattling sound came from her throat, and her eyes bulged as if they were about to pop. Her gaze shifted manically between the silver suitcase in my hand and the distant gray one. The last forced composure on her face completely crumbled, leaving only naked, uncomprehending shock and the colossal terror that followed. Emily was the first to move. She pushed a cart and walked happily toward the carousel, humming a little tune. She didn't notice the inspection area and didn't see the suitcase that was supposed to be covered in glittery stickers. She was looking at her phone, probably checking the weather. "Emily!" Carol suddenly let out a short, ragged scream, as if she had poured all her remaining strength into it. Emily was startled and looked up. "Mom, what's wrong? Why are you being so dramatic? Don't go over there." Carol stretched out her hand, but it was shaking so violently that she couldn't point properly. She didn't know whether to point at the inspection area, at me, or at the approaching carousel. "How am I supposed to get my stuff if I don't go over there?" Emily replied, not understanding her mother. She thought her mom was losing her mind, so she rolled her eyes and kept walking. "Come back!" Carol's voice cracked, catching the attention of people nearby. She tried to chase after Emily but stumbled and nearly fell. Arthur caught her. "Carol, what on earth are you doing?" "Have some decency," he hissed, embarrassed. In the midst of the commotion, a female officer noticed them. Her gaze landed squarely on Emily, a young woman pushing an empty cart toward the carousel. The baggage owner's information on her device matched the face. She exchanged a look with her colleague, and they both walked toward Emily. "Excuse me, ma'am." The female officer stopped Emily. Her voice was firm. "Is this your luggage?" She pointed to the gray suitcase in the inspection area. Emily stared for a moment at the ugly gray cover and automatically shook her head. "No. My suitcase is silver and has stickers on it." Before she could finish her sentence, she saw the baggage tag attached to the side of the suitcase. Her name was clearly printed on it, Emily Davidson. "That's my name. But this isn't my suitcase," Emily said, confused, as she moved closer to take off the cover. A male officer raised a hand to stop her. "Please come with us. We need to conduct a further inspection on your belongings." The man's tone was unyielding. "Inspection? Why do you need to inspect my things?" Emily started to panic, her voice rising. "It's just full of clothes and makeup. What right do you have?" The commotion finally caught Mark's attention. He had been helping Arthur get 2 suitcases off the carousel. He hurried over, pulling me behind him. His brow was furrowed as he looked at his sister, who was surrounded by officers. "What's going on?" "They say there's a problem with my suitcase. They want to open it," Emily complained, as if she had found an ally. Her face was full of indignation. "And why is my bag this ugly color? The airline must have made a mistake." Carol saw the 2 officers leading Emily toward the inspection table. When she saw them place the gray suitcase on the tabletop, she suddenly broke free from Arthur's grip and lunged forward like a fish flopping on land, screaming and crying. "Sir, ma'am, you're making a mistake. That's not my daughter's. That's not my daughter's bag. It belongs to my daughter-in-law, Lena. You should be inspecting her things." She pointed at me, her finger trembling from extreme emotion and fear. Her once composed face was now twisted in a grimace. All the surrounding passengers turned to stare and started whispering. The two officers paused and looked at me, then at the seemingly crazed Carol. Their eyes were filled with professional judgment and a hint of annoyance. The male officer asked, "Ma'am, please calm down. Are you saying this luggage belongs to that lady?" He looked at me. All eyes were on me. Mark tightened his grip on my hand. "Mom, what are you talking about?" he said softly. Arthur was in disbelief. Emily's eyes widened, her gaze shifting between her mother and me, stunned. I met Carol's burning, desperate glare. I took a step forward, my face showing clear confusion and hurt. I held up the silver suitcase I was carrying. The luggage tag on its side, bearing Emily's name, was clearly visible under the lights. "Carol," I spoke in a calm voice, tinged with sadness. "I know you've never liked me, but how could you say something like that? This is Emily's suitcase. I've been holding it for her this whole time." I gently handed the suitcase to Emily. "Maybe you're just confused. That gray suitcase isn't mine. My suitcase was checked in with Dad's and Mark's luggage. We already have it." I pointed to a standard black suitcase at Mark's feet. That was my original checked bag. It was as if Carol had been struck by lightning. She looked at the silver suitcase in my hand, the black suitcase, and finally at the gray suitcase on the inspection table, which was about to be opened like Pandora's box, her logic completely shattered. The thing she herself had planted was supposed to be in my suitcase, but my black suitcase was safe, and Emily's silver carry-on was in my hands. And the gray suitcase about to be opened, Emily's suitcase, had Emily's name on it. She finally realized. From the very beginning, from the moment she had secretly opened my suitcase last night to plant something, she had fallen into a silent trap. The early morning switch of luggage tags and ribbons, all her supposedly secret plans had boomeranged back onto her own daughter. Don't open it!" she screamed, forgetting everything, and charged as if to throw herself onto the table. The male officer quickly blocked her. "Ma'am, step back, or we will be forced to take necessary action." Arthur finally grasped the gravity of the situation and quickly restrained his hysterical wife. Mark protectively shielded me even more, his face pale as he looked at his mother with a mixture of shock and suspicion. Emily was terrified, clutching Mark's sleeve. "Mark, what's happening? Is Mom going crazy?" The female officer didn't hesitate any longer. She took out a tool and, with a snap, cut the lock on the gray suitcase. In the silence, with Carol only able to gasp in desperation, she lifted the lid. On top were neatly folded clothes. The officer moved them aside. Underneath, several rectangular objects tightly wrapped in plastic film appeared, and in a corner there were a few dark-colored velvet pouches, clearly not ordinary travel items. With a gloved hand, the officer picked up one of the rectangular objects and felt it. She opened a small pouch and pulled out several rough, uncut gemstones that glittered under the airport lights. Murmurs of shock rippled through the crowd. The male officer immediately spoke into his radio, his voice quick and clear. Suspected undeclared raw gemstones and controlled substances found. Requesting backup. Carol watched as those items were brought out one by one, her soul seeming to be sucked out of her. Her body went limp, and if Arthur hadn't been holding her, she would have collapsed. The last hint of human color vanished from her face. Her lips trembled, tears and snot mixing on her face. Her eyes lost focus, and she repeatedly whispered, "It's over, my daughter, Emily. It's over." When Emily saw the things that came out of her suitcase, she turned pale. "That's not mine! I've never seen any of that stuff before!" she shrieked. "Mom, say something! What is going on?" Backup arrived quickly and secured the scene. As the person whose name was on the luggage tag, Emily had to go with them for questioning. She was crying and trying to explain, "My mom packed that. I don't know anything." Carol had sunk to the floor, unresponsive to her daughter's accusations. Only her repetitive trance-like whispers could be heard. "It's my fault. It's all my fault. Don't take my daughter. Take me instead. Take me." Mark was stunned. He looked at me, at his grieving and terrified sister, at the box of shocking evidence. His face was ashen. He couldn't speak. His hand holding mine was as cold as ice. I stood silently beside him, watching the chaos that Carol herself had created, a chaos that had ultimately destroyed her. The bright lights of the airport highlighted the anxiety, desperation, shock, and hopelessness on everyone's face. Meanwhile, my suitcase, the black bag containing only clothes and wellness supplements, stood quietly at my feet, a silent witness, and this was only the beginning. The thick door of the airport security office closed, muffling Emily's desperate sobs. 2 uniformed officers stood guard outside, blocking the view from the corridor and deflecting Arthur's questions. Carol sat on a plastic chair in the waiting area like a lifeless rag doll. She stared at the door, silent tears streaming down her face, only broken, choked sobs escaping her. "Emily, my child." Mark's face was gray. He pulled me to a corner, away from the others. His voice was low but couldn't hide its tremor. "Lena, what did Mom really put in the suitcase? Those things." He had clearly seen the items they'd taken out, things that were obviously not ordinary. I shook my head, my face a mask of matching shock and gravity. "I don't know, Mark. I honestly don't know." I squeezed his cold hand. Could she have been trying to smuggle something dangerous? She was so scared of getting caught, so maybe. I left the sentence unfinished, leaving enough space for his imagination. Mark's thoughts were in turmoil. He looked at his catatonic mother and the closed door. Behind it was his sister, whom he had always protected. He swallowed hard, veins popping on his forehead. How could she use Emily as a shield? Her own daughter? He said the words in a near whisper. The feeling of being betrayed and used by the person closest to him was slowly eroding the trust and respect he had for his mother over the years. Arthur tried to talk to the officers, but it was useless. He was sweating with anxiety, but the only answer he received was, "Please wait patiently. Please cooperate with the investigation." He came back and looked at his lifeless wife. For the first time, he showed open anger and disappointment. "Carol, tell me the truth. What kind of things did you put in Emily's suitcase? You're ruining your daughter's life." Carol's whole body trembled at her husband's shout. Her unfocused eyes briefly met his. Her lips quivered, but she couldn't form a complete sentence. She wanted to explain, to say that the suitcase wasn't really for Emily, but the evidence was undeniable. The tag was Emily's, and it had come out of baggage claim addressed to Emily. Even the waterproof cover now looked like a deliberate deception. She whipped her head around and glared at me, her eyes filled with resentment. But underneath it, there was a deeper, bone-chilling fear and a disbelieving shock, as if she was finally understanding everything. You did this," she said, her hoarse voice like a broken record. "You swapped them. You knew. You knew from the beginning." I met her gaze. There was no trace of triumph on my face, only deep sadness and confusion. "Carol, what are you talking about? What did I know? How could I possibly know you were going to put things like that in Emily's suitcase? That's impossible." I paused, adding a slight edge to my voice. "Or, whose suitcase were you really supposed to put it in?" That question was like a cold nail driven into Carol. Her whole body shook. Mark and Arthur's heads snapped toward me. That was right. If those things weren't meant for Emily's suitcase, where were they supposed to have gone? Carol was speechless. Her mouth opened and closed, her chest rising and falling rapidly. She was pale. She wanted to tell the truth, but what was the truth? That she had tried to frame her daughter-in-law but ended up framing her own daughter? How could she say that? What would her son and husband think? And besides, the most important thing right now was Emily. She rushed to Arthur, grabbing his arm and crying, "Arthur, Arthur, do something to save Emily. Don't let them take her. Emily doesn't know anything. It's all my fault. Let them take me instead." Arthur angrily shook off her hand. "You're thinking of that now? When you put those things in there, did you think that Emily was your daughter?" The situation was at a standstill, and every second felt like slow torture. Finally, the door opened. An officer who seemed to be in charge came out, followed by a pale, puffy-eyed, sobbing Emily. 2 female staff members were behind her. "Miss Davidson can be temporarily released," the officer announced. "However, she must remain available for follow-up investigation. This luggage and its contents will be confiscated. Undeclared goods and items suspected of violating regulations were found." The case has been filed, and prosecution will be determined based on the investigation's results." As soon as Emily was out, she threw herself into Mark's arms and cried her heart out. "Mark, I was so scared. They asked so many questions. I don't know anything." "Mom, what did you put in my suitcase?" she sobbed, pounding on her mother. Carol hugged her daughter, and they cried together. Arthur repeatedly thanked the officer, promising full cooperation. Mark held his distraught sister, looking at his mother with complicated emotions. The love he once had for her was gone from his eyes. Amidst this chaos, I stood silently. I watched Carol's humiliation, unable to even explain herself, Emily's crying from fear and resentment, the collapse of trust in Mark's eyes, and the disappointment on Arthur's face. I knew this was only the beginning. The seizure and investigation were just the first whip cracks that would strip away this family's facade of decency. In a heavy silence, we pushed the remaining luggage carts and left the airport. The warm California sun hit our bodies but couldn't dispel the chill in our hearts. The car our friend had arranged to pick us up had been waiting for a long time. When we got in, Arthur practically had to drag Carol, who had no strength left. Emily sat next to me, far from her mother, occasionally glaring at her with resentment. The car drove toward the hotel we had booked. No one spoke the entire way. The sights outside the blue ocean, the palm trees, no one was in the mood to appreciate them now. When we arrived at the hotel lobby, as we were checking in, Carol's cell phone rang. The shrill sound echoed in the silence. She hastily grabbed it, looked at the number, and instantly went pale. Her fingers were trembling so much she could barely hold the phone. She walked to a corner, turned her back to us, and answered the call. Even from a distance, I could hear her suppressed, desperate pleading. "No, not my daughter. You're mistaken. Please. The money. I'll figure something out, please." The fragmented words were like broken shards of ice hitting the floor. Mark was standing next to me and clearly heard some of it. His face hardened even more, and he clenched his fists. Carol's call didn't last long. She hung up and looked like a camel whose back had just been broken by the last straw. She suddenly went limp. Amid the shocked stares of other hotel guests, her eyes rolled back, and she collapsed. "Mom!" Mark and Arthur shouted simultaneously. The hotel lobby erupted into a chaotic scene. Carol, the woman who was always calculating and obsessed with her reputation, had fainted on the polished floor of a California hotel. The sound of an ambulance siren approached from a distance, the first and most stunning welcome she would receive in the state. And her nightmare, the karma she had tried to impose on me but which had returned to her, was only just beginning. The smell of disinfectant was strong in the hospital corridor. The pale fluorescent light cast a grayish pallor on everyone's faces. Carol was lying in a private room with an IV in her arm. Her eyes were closed, but they moved restlessly beneath her eyelids, and her lips occasionally trembled. The doctor said she had fainted from extreme stress and exhaustion. There were no serious physical problems, but she needed rest. Mark was leaning against the window, looking out at the dark sky, his back rigid. Emily sat in a chair against the wall, her eyes swollen red like apples. She stared at her mother with a look that mixed fear, resentment, and a growing bitterness. Arthur sat by the bed, his face buried in his hands. His shoulders were slumped. He seemed to have aged 10 years in one night. A cold silence filled the room, broken only by the steady beep of the heart monitor. "Ugh!" A faint groan escaped Carol. She blinked a few times and slowly opened her eyes. At first, her gaze was vacant, staring at the ceiling. Then, as if all her memories came rushing back, her eyes widened, and she looked at the people by her bed. Emily. Her voice was hoarse and broken. The first person she looked for was her daughter. When Emily heard her name, she flinched slightly but didn't stand up or answer. She just stared more intently in the other direction. "Emily's here." "She's fine," Arthur sighed, gesturing toward the corner. Carol's eyes quickly found her daughter, and she seemed to breathe a sigh of relief when she saw her sitting there safely. But then, everything that had happened before she fainted came flooding back. The open suitcase, the items that had come out, and that deadly phone call. Her breathing suddenly quickened, and the heart monitor beeped faster. "Mom." Mark finally turned from the window and walked to the bed. His voice was heavy, full of suppressed emotion. "How are you feeling?" Carol looked at her son, then at me. I was standing behind Mark, quietly pouring a glass of water. Her gaze lingered on my face for a moment, filled with an unconcealable fear and doubt, as if she couldn't understand how everything had spun out of her control. She didn't know where she had gone wrong. "I'm fine." She tried to sit up, but Arthur stopped her. "Emily, is Emily really okay? Did they let her go for good?" "Emily's fine for now. But the suitcase was confiscated. The case isn't closed yet," Mark answered curtly. He stared at his mother. "Mom, what were those things, really? Where did they come from, and why did you bring them?" The series of questions was like stones thrown into a still pond. Carol turned pale again. She avoided her son's gaze, her lips trembling. "I don't know. I don't know what those things were. Maybe Emily accidentally packed them." "Mom!" Emily shot up from her chair, her voice shrill and ragged. "You're still blaming me even now? I've never seen those rocks and powders in my life. I didn't even know my suitcase had a cover on it. You're the one who packed it. You said you would double-check my things. You said my suitcase was too flashy and needed to be covered." Caught in her own daughter's furious accusation, Carol trembled violently. She looked at Emily's angry and resentful face, her son's probing gaze, and Arthur. Finally, she turned to her husband with a pleading look. "Arthur, no, it's not true." "That's enough, Carol." Arthur looked up, his face set with a rare firmness and disappointment. His voice wasn't loud, but it landed like a hammer. "The officers aren't stupid. The items came out of a suitcase with Emily's name on it. You packed it. Now, either you intended to frame your own daughter," he paused, his gaze sharpening, "or Emily wasn't your original target." The air in the room suddenly turned icy. Mark's head snapped from his father to me, his eyes wide with a dawning horror and suspicion. Emily was also stunned, processing her father's words. Carol was like she'd been electrocuted, frozen on the bed. She even stopped breathing, her mouth hanging open as a rattling sound escaped her throat. That one sentence from Arthur had pushed her to the edge of a cliff. At the same time, it had stripped away her deepest, ugliest motive. "Don't talk nonsense," she finally managed to say, her voice high-pitched and weak. "How could I frame Emily? She's my daughter." "So you admit you're the one who put those things in there?" Mark quickly seized on the flaw in her statement. His voice was laced with disappointment. "You put them in knowing they were illegal, knowing there would be huge trouble if they were found." "Mom, what was your real plan? Who were you giving them to? Or who ordered you to do it?" "No one ordered me. No one." Carol shook her head frantically, jostling her IV stand. "It was just me. I was stupid. A relative just asked me to bring some local products. I didn't know it was so serious. I was scared to put them in my own suitcase. I thought maybe they don't inspect kids' luggage as closely." "So you chose Emily," Mark said coldly. "Or maybe, your first choice was Lena." When the last name came out, the room fell silent again. All eyes turned back to me. I set down the water pitcher and looked up, my face showing clear shock and a touch of pain. I looked at Carol and spoke very softly, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "Carol, were you planning to put that in my suitcase?" My tone wasn't angry, only one of disbelief and hurt. Such a reaction was more powerful than any shouting match. Carol's face turned ashen gray. She looked at me, the daughter-in-law she had always looked down on, whom she felt was unworthy of her son, and I was now looking at her with clear, wounded eyes. She wanted to deny it, but Mark's and Arthur's gazes were like knives pointed at her. If she admitted it, she would be admitting that she had intentionally tried to frame her daughter-in-law. She was trapped. A coldness spread through her entire body. An invisible net had entangled her, and the more she struggled, the tighter it became. "No, not me," she whispered nonsensically. Tears streamed down her face. This time, it wasn't an act. These were real tears of intense fear and desperation. "Mark, son, believe Mom. I would never hurt anyone. Enough, Mom," Mark cut her off. The last trace of warmth had vanished from his eyes, replaced by deep fatigue and judgment. "Are you still not going to tell the truth? That phone call, the one before you fainted. Who was that? Who were you begging not to touch your daughter? Was that the relative who asked you to bring some products? Would they have you pleading like that? With that barrage of questions, Carol completely broke down. She covered her face and sobbed, her cries echoing in the quiet room, full of despair and regret. But whether that regret was for harming her daughter or for the fear of her own failed plan, only she knew. Emily saw her mother's state, and the resentment on her face slowly gave way to a complex numbness. She slowly sat back down, hugged her knees, and didn't look at her mother again. Arthur sighed deeply and turned away. Mark came to my side and took my hand. His hand was cold, but his grip was firm. He looked at me, and in his eyes there was regret, relief, and an unspoken joy that I was safe, a relief that it wasn't me who had been harmed. I said nothing and squeezed his hand back. I looked out the window. The sky was turning a dark indigo. In the distance, the city lights twinkled like scattered diamonds. Carol's sobbing gradually subsided into broken whimpers. She knew that her authority and the image she had built in this family for years had been confiscated along with those illegal goods, the ugly contents underneath exposed, and the real storm hadn't even arrived yet. The person on the other end of that phone call wouldn't forgive her just because she fainted. A new day was dawning, but for Carol Davidson, morning was still a long way off. This night in the hospital was just a brief respite before the judgment. Carol's crying finally faded to a last, ragged breath. The room was filled only with the steady beep of the machine and the faint hum of traffic from outside. Everyone's face was etched with exhaustion and a numbness, as if they had been cut by the shards of truth. Mark let go of my hand and walked to the foot of the bed. He rested his hands on the cold metal railing, not looking at his mother but at the floor. His voice was hoarse, as if all his strength had been drained. "Mom, can we talk about the call now? Who was it, really? And those things. What's their connection?" Carol was sunk into the pillow, her eyes swollen and staring blankly at the ceiling. She knew she couldn't hide it anymore. The trust in her son's eyes had shattered. Her husband's face showed an unfamiliar distance. Her daughter's gaze was full of cold resentment, and the person she had tried to frame was standing unscathed in a corner, silently watching her downfall. "My uncle," she finally spoke, her voice so faint it was barely audible, each word seeming to be squeezed out. "Robert." Arthur was startled and looked up. "Robert? Didn't he say he was in the business of exporting and importing handicrafts?" "Handicrafts?" Carol smiled bitterly, fresh tears welling up. "That was all a lie. He's been shipping things for other people for a long time. Jade, herbal medicines, some kind of powders or ointments I don't know about. He said they were valuable items with a high profit margin. There's a businessman here who buys them at a high price. He said the inspection here isn't very strict." She continued, her speech faltering. "This time, he said it was a big transaction. There was a lot of stuff, so it was risky for him to carry it all himself. He found out we were going on vacation and said that security is more lenient with families traveling, so he asked me for a favor." "And you agreed, Mom?" Mark's voice rose, thick with suppressed rage. "Just to help your good-for-nothing uncle, you put our whole family at risk? And you deliberately targeted your daughter-in-law's suitcase?" The last sentence was almost a shout. Carol flinched at her son's anger. "I didn't want to put the family in danger." Robert said it was well packaged and wouldn't be discovered. "I just thought that if it was all in one suitcase, then if something went wrong, the rest of us wouldn't be implicated." Her voice dropped to a whisper, her eyes darting around nervously. "So you chose Lena," Mark finished for her, each word as cold as ice. "Because she's an outsider, because you think she can be sacrificed at any time. Am I right?" "No," Carol explained weakly, but under her son's all-seeing gaze, she looked ridiculous. Her dark motive was now laid bare under the light, and even she was disgusted with herself. "And the call?" Mark pressed on relentlessly. "It was Robert who called?" "No." The last trace of color drained from Carol's face. Her lips began to tremble. "It was the person who was supposed to receive the goods. His last name is Miller. They call him Mr. Miller." Her voice was filled with terror. "He was furious that the goods didn't arrive and that the authorities got involved. He said I was playing him. He said my daughter Emily would be the first one he'd go after." As she spoke, she looked at Emily with terror, as if her daughter might vanish at any moment. That animal! Arthur slammed his fist on the armrest of his chair, his whole body shaking with rage. Carol, you're insane. You got involved with people like that, and now you've endangered your own child. I didn't know it would be like this, Carol cried. Robert said the payoff would be huge if the delivery was successful. He said there would be no problems. How was I supposed to know security here was so strict? I didn't know how serious those things were. I didn't know Mr. Miller was so terrifying. You didn't know? Mark laughed, a cold, humorless sound. It's not that you didn't know, Mom. It's that you didn't care. Because of your own greed, you didn't care if Lena went to jail. You probably even thought that if Lena was in trouble, I could finally divorce her and replace her with someone you approved of. And as for Emily, you believed that as long as the stuff was in my suitcase or Lena's, she wouldn't be implicated. And then I would have to stay by your side to clean up the mess. What a brilliant plan. Those words completely stripped away the last of Carol's dignity. She stopped crying and stared blankly at her son, as if seeing him for the first time. She had always thought this son of hers was obedient and loving. She had thought that even if she didn't like her daughter-in-law, her son would ultimately side with her. But in Mark's mind, everything was crystal clear. He had seen it all along, but had held his tongue out of respect for his mother. Today's events had finally shattered that respect. Mark, son, Mom, she tried to grasp at straws. Mom, Mark cut her off, his voice colder and firmer than ever before. This problem is yours to solve. You will tell Robert and Mr. Miller that the authorities confiscated the goods, and the whole thing is a bust. Whatever they plan to do to you is between you and them. Emily, Lena, and Dad have nothing to do with this dirty business anymore. Do you understand? Carol felt as if she had been plunged into a well of ice. Her son's words were effectively throwing her to the wolves. She was terrified. Mark, don't do this to me. They'll kill me. Those people are ruthless. Did you think, Mom, that Lena or Emily might be in danger when you put those things in the suitcase? Mark asked, his eyes unwavering. Carol couldn't speak, only shaking in silent desperation. I walked over to Mark and gently touched his arm. In a quiet, calm voice, I said to Carol, Carol, the most important thing right now is how to fix this. You should rest and get your strength back. If Mr. Miller calls again, you need to have something to tell him. After all, the items were found in a suitcase with Emily's name on it. To the police, Emily is still a person of interest. On the surface, it sounded like I was concerned for her, but in reality, I was once again laying the cruelest truth before her. Emily's case would not be solved by her fainting or crying. The only way to save Emily was for her, the true perpetrator, to take full responsibility and provide clear evidence. Carol looked at me, her eyes incredibly complex. At this moment, she finally began to truly see the daughter-in-law she had never paid any attention to. My calmness, my detachment, and even my current advice felt like a soft knife, causing her a pain that went deep to the bone, yet she couldn't even scream. She realized that from that moment on, she had embarked on a one-way road, and at the end of that road was not the trap she had set for me, but a door to isolation and an unknown fear. No, she said to the air. No. She trembled helplessly. Outside, the sky was turning gray. The new day brought not hope for Carol Davidson, but the beginning of a deeper suffering. She lay in the bed as if she could hear the heavy footsteps of fate approaching her. And the other people in the room, her husband, her son, her daughter, stood a few steps away, creating a deep chasm of silence between them. The name of that chasm was consequence. The sun finally rose. The morning began with a cool ocean breeze. In the hotel suite, no one had slept. Carol had been sitting on the sofa in the living room all night. When the sky lightened, the dark circles under her eyes looked like bruises, making her appear even more haggard and wretched. Mark woke up early and called a legal aid agency he had contacted the night before to set up a meeting for the morning. His voice on the phone was calm and clear, the picture of a steadfast head of the family facing a crisis. The image of the confused and hurt son was gone. Arthur also woke up early and silently packed a bag. He put some documents and clothes that Carol might need into a small duffel. His movements were slow but deliberate, and he didn't speak a word to his wife. That silence was heavier than any reprimand. Emily's bedroom door only opened when we were about to leave. Her eyes were still swollen, but the youthful innocence had vanished from her face, replaced by a hardness and distance that seemed to have been forced upon her overnight. She glanced at her mother, a look that was cold and foreign, then quickly turned to me and whispered, "Lena, I'm coming with you." She didn't say she was going with her mom. Carol looked at her daughter. Her lips moved as if to call her name, but in the end, she just lowered her head helplessly. The 5 of us silently left the hotel and took a taxi to the legal aid agency. Outside the window was the bright sunshine and the busy streets of the city, but the air inside the car was suffocatingly heavy. Carol clutched the small bag, her knuckles white. She stared blankly outside, her body still trembling slightly. The meeting was long and painful. In a small conference room, facing a serious-looking lawyer and a social worker, Carol initially tried to be evasive. But when Mark calmly added details, and Emily tearfully recounted her fear and ignorance, and when Arthur produced evidence of Robert's suspicious past transactions, Carol's defense completely collapsed. She finally broke down, sobbing, and told the whole story. How Robert had approached her, explaining the high profits and low risks of the operation. How he had taught her to hide the specially packaged goods among ordinary items, and how he had insinuated that it was safest to put it in Lena's suitcase because if things went wrong, she was expendable. She also provided Mr. Miller's phone number and the bits of information she had gleaned from their conversations, a notorious fixer in the local community with various businesses, known for his ruthlessness. The lawyer's brow furrowed as he took notes. This was not a simple regulatory violation but a case bordering on illegal transport and organized crime. The lawyer clearly told Carol that as the perpetrator with knowledge of the crime, even if she cooperated fully, she would still face serious legal consequences. But he emphasized that her cooperation was crucial in clarifying the facts, especially in removing Emily from the list of suspects. At the same time, the lawyer advised them to report it to the local police immediately to protect the family from possible retaliation from Mr. Miller. When they left the agency, Carol was like a deflated balloon, devoid of strength and needing Arthur's support. But Arthur's support was no longer that of a caring husband, but merely the fulfillment of an obligation. Mark immediately used the lawyer's phone to call the local police to report the situation, and they scheduled a formal statement for that afternoon. The next 2 days were a whirlwind. We cooperated with the police in multiple investigations and statements. Carol was forbidden from leaving the state until the investigation was concluded. Robert's contact information was submitted to the police for investigation. As for Mr. Miller, the police said they would handle it and advised us to be careful, but they also assured us that since the goods had been seized, the transaction had been exposed, and the courier had surrendered, it was unlikely Mr. Miller would waste any more time on it, as it was no longer valuable and risked attracting police attention. Emily, after repeated confirmations from the lawyer and the police, was officially classified as a non-responsible third party with no subjective intent. The huge weight on her chest was finally lifted. She hugged Mark and cried her heart out, and her gaze toward her mother was now filled with numbness and complete detachment. She never spoke to Carol again. Arthur, after all the legal processes were settled, made a decision in front of everyone. He told Carol, "When this is all over, when we get back home, we're getting a divorce. The house is yours. I'll take my share of our savings. Mark and Emily are grown up. We don't need to force ourselves to stay together anymore. For years, you've only thought about your side of the family, your calculations. This house hasn't been a home for a long time." His voice was calm but sounded like a final judgment. Carol didn't cry when she heard this. She just stared blankly at her husband, as if she didn't understand or had already been expecting it. She no longer had the strength or desire to argue or plead. Divorce, the alienation of her children, this was the final price for her misguided greed and malice. The original 2-week vacation was, of course, completely ruined. While waiting for the preliminary results of the case, and since Carol couldn't leave yet, Mark suggested taking Emily and me to a nearby place to get some fresh air, so that this trip isn't just a complete nightmare in our memories. Arthur agreed. We went to a beach. The blue sea and white sand were beautiful. Surfers danced on the waves. Emily walked barefoot on the shore, letting the waves wash over her feet. The sadness on her face was gradually carried away by the sea breeze. Mark held my hand, and we silently watched where the sea met the sky. "I'm sorry, Lena," he said suddenly, his voice soft, almost lost in the wind. "For years, I let you be hurt. I knew Mom didn't like you, but I always thought that if we were just patient and tolerant, the family would be fine. But my tolerance only enabled her, and it almost got you into terrible trouble." I squeezed his hand and shook my head. "That's over now. What matters is the future." "The future?" He looked at me, his eyes resolute. "In the future, we will be the ones who decide what our family looks like. No one will ever hurt you or interfere in our lives again." We had lunch at a cafe near the beach. The sun was warm and the food was delicious. Emily still didn't talk much, but she occasionally chatted with me about the local sights. Arthur was quiet for most of the time, but the frown lines on his forehead had disappeared. Even his gaze toward the sea held a hint of relief. That brief afternoon felt like a ray of sunshine breaking through the thick clouds of the past few days. It couldn't heal all the wounds, but it reminded us that beyond the sinister plots and cold judgments, there was also sunlight, waves, and the warmth of mutual support. A week later, the preliminary results of the case came out. Carol, due to her voluntary surrender and cooperation, and because the seized items, though illegal, were not in the most severe category like drugs or weapons but were controlled special herbs and undeclared high-value gemstones, was sentenced to a large fine and probation. Her record would remain. Robert and Mr. Miller would be dealt with by the police. That was another long and complicated story, but it no longer had much to do with us, especially Emily. Carol, alone, carrying the fine notice and endless regret or fear for her future, was finally allowed to return home. Arthur didn't accompany her. Mark and Emily didn't go either. Only I, as a representative of the family and the original target of this whole affair, saw her off at the airport. In front of the security checkpoint, she looked at me. For the first time, her eyes held no pride or blame, only a gray emptiness. Her mouth opened and closed, as if she wanted to say something, perhaps an apology or a curse. I didn't give her the chance. I said calmly, "Carol, take care. When you get back home, face what you have to face. From now on, let's all just live our lives in peace." She looked at me, her eyes complex and unreadable. In the end, she said nothing. She pulled her small suitcase and walked into the security check with her head down. Her figure disappeared into the crowd. Her once imposing image, the woman who wanted to control everything, now looked incredibly small and lonely. I walked out of the airport. The sun was bright outside. Mark's car was parked by the curb. I got into the passenger seat, and he leaned over to fasten my seatbelt, then gently kissed my forehead. "Let's go home," he said. "Yes, let's go home." I held his hand. The car pulled away from the airport, heading back to our own lives, a life we had to rebuild and redefine. The past was finally past. Even if there were still challenges ahead, at least we had seen each other's true hearts and held each other's hands tightly. And the person who tried to create a storm with a small suitcase was ultimately swallowed by the waves she herself had made.